Right, welcome to the William Lamb studio. This is the wee courtyard, and you can see that the building has been designed as a studio with the tall windows to get lots of light. And this little courtyard that she had laid out in bricks, which have since been replaced. This is one of his sculptures, one of the many that are actually out and about. The Paris, he had a great French connection, but it literally just means the lazy boy. James Finlay was the model who went on to be an architect, and it's a very popular sculpture that it's been in other places of the town, but it's now residing in the courtyard. So, do come in. This is the main studio, which was Lamb's working studio from, say, 1936 till his death. This is the man himself, of course. Self-portrait. A wee background: he was in the army, he was injured, he had to learn he trained completely with his left hand, having lost the use of his right hand. So nearly all the works you see here were produced after he retrained, and he spent a fair amount of time recuperating after 1919, I'm afraid. His first studio was actually in Montrose, and it was in 1924 when he came back to the town. And this man, George Cathro, was a keen amateur of watercolours, and really his first patron. But he had a painting and decorators business, and he gave Lamb a little garret attic to the uninitiated in his glazier's shop, which was quite good because it meant he was able to get pictures framed and glazed. The only trouble being that it was really cold in the winter time, and in the summer, luckily, he managed to get the use of this lady's studio, a fellow artist, Agnes or Nan Sim. She was the daughter of an architect and very well off. Her father had built her a studio in the garden, which had heating, which meant he could actually sculpt in the winter time. But come the 1930s, I think he began to itch to have his own studio, and he was very fortunate, if we walk over here, to get a royal commission. He'd known the Queen Mother, then Duchess of York, for a couple of years, who bought some pictures of his from a done studio in Brecon, and the then Duchess of York chatted to him about a possible sculpture of her daughter, HRH Elizabeth, our present Queen, who's just died, I'm afraid. And he was invited down to Piccadilly in December 1932, and he pretty well stayed there right through to the end of February, by which time he'd done Elizabeth, Princess Margaret Rose as well, and no fewer than two of the Duchess of York herself. And this commission did two great things for Lamb. One, it threw him into the limelight. Suddenly he was a royal portrait sculptor, and everybody wants a bit of that. But it also gave him some wherewithal. So this studio, he, with his friend George Fairweather, who was an architect, he purchased two old cottages in May 1934 for the princely sum of £35. I've never been able to find out how much it cost him over the next year or so to do all the work, but anyway, sadly the builder died before the project was finished, and Lamb and Fairweather had to do quite a lot of the work themselves to complete it. So we have the main studio here with a great collection of friends, portraits of young lads and other worthies in the town, and one or two important characters as well. Christopher Murray Grieve, as he was, came to Montrose in the 20s, and he was editor, reporter, head bottle washer, whatever, with the Montrose paper, and he seemed to be at the same time a communist and a nationalist. but no more of that. But he founded a group called the Scottish Renaissance Group, and it was a collection of artists, poets, writers. It was a brilliant idea, and often people talk about the Scottish Renaissance as being founded in Montrose for that result, and they met weekly to chat. So when William Lamb came back to Montrose in 24, he joined that group. But Lamb was not an orator of any kind. He would sit in the corner and just carefully watch people, and of course people who watched him realised he was drawing them or writing things. So this portrait he produced of Grieve as he was then in 27, and he tried to make it as realistic as possible. There are other portraits of MacDiarmid, including Benham Shots, which is probably quite well known as well, but with personal bias I think it's one of the best because it captures his fierce look sometimes and that brilliant hairstyle which is so diagnostic. The two men, I don't think they were great friends, but I think they each had an admiration for each other's work, and that was certainly borne out. I only found this photograph of the opening of the studio opening of the studio after his death, that is, in 1955, and there, among the guests, was a photograph of MacDiarmid. So he obviously came back, so great chap. But he did do other portraits of poets as well. I'll just stop by Pittenrich McGilvray. McGilvry's probably better known as sculptor to the king, and he looks every inch the sculptor. And it's a huge compliment to Lamb that he would pick on someone he regarded as a competent sculptor. So it's a huge accolade. Pittenrich, however, was also a bit of a poet. I've found a few of his poems. He was all round a sort of cultural character. In fact, was tangled up with MacDiarmid as well, because the organisation that I think was founded later, PEN, he was a member of that, and it met in Edinburgh usually. But fantastic bit of work, and great for Lamb to have been so selected. But perhaps the best known Angus poet, however, is Violet Jacob, and she was of the landed gentry from House of Dun, a Kennedy by name, but married a Jacob, and I'm not quite sure how the two met, but they seemed to know each other certainly before 24, and this portrait of her makes her look, A, a bit fierce, and B, a bit filled out because she was almost too thin, so Lamb tried to beef her out a wee bit. But they were great pals. She was a very, very competent watercolourist, and he unveiled MacDiarmid to her. So she was the first to see him, and they both started giggling because it just captured his sort of fierce, haughty expression. These other two are also artists of repute. David Foggie was a Dundee artist, and when Lamb was recuperating after the war, one of the places he went was Edinburgh College of Art, where his drawing master, a person of almost identical age, was David Foggie, and the two hit it off. So he did this beautiful portrait of Foggie, and Foggie responded by doing a really, really attractive little ink drawing as well. Another Montrose artist, though, was Edward Baird, younger than Lamb and almost the complete opposite in styles. Lamb loved drawing without lifting his hand off the paper, whereas Baird would spend an equal amount of time with every square inch, as it were, whether it was background or not. But it's often said the two of them didn't get on, but they did. When MacDiarmid left Montrose, Baird took over as the kind of Renaissance chair, as it were. But he was a very competent watercolourist, and his paintings, much fewer in number, nonetheless, are very much sought after. And he Lamb bought him his first easel, and sadly he predeceased Lamb, and Lamb actually helped hang his memorial exhibition. Yes, these are all, some would call them figures, but he latched onto the word maquettes. Again, the French spell that he had in 22-23, he went to l'École des Beaux-Arts under a Professor Boucher, who didn't accept just anybody, and Boucher accused him of copying Rodin. He didn't know who Rodin was, so he went to the Rodin Museum, as I have done, and you'll find that small working models, Rodin called them maquettes, which is just a sketch, as it were. And he captured so many working people, again, fisher folk. You see the man with the muscle-beating lines. He captured woodworkers here, making little cobbles and boats for the fishing. And very few of these did he exhibit. This is perhaps the best known one, landing the catch. Three men in the bad old days when they actually pulled in salmon in the river in nets, just taking 2/3 of the river width. And again, you can see the obsession. You can begin to tell those that are salmon fishers and those that are ferried in fishers, the different kinds of fishing folk. I had 2 Japanese visitors in this year, and they said to me in rather broken English, "This looks like the work of a different man." I said, yes, because in 1940 the foundries stopped doing bronze. They were channeled into munitions, so bronze stopped and Lamb took up wood carving. And you can see here that the style is totally different. Because of his inexperience in working with wood, he often chose poor bits of wood, but some of these, if you look at some of his etchings and drawings, he loves these swirling robes of fisher women, and the gale force, the one that you're looking at here, is perhaps one of the pinnacle, but a great many others are these rather misty characters coming out of the har on the shore, and again much sought after. They do turn up from time to time, but they're very rarely signed. Yes, when my other life, when I was district museum curator, we actually started a programme of casting Lamb's plasters into bronze, and this was the first one. Nowadays called the Seafarer, and the bronze was cast. There was no foundry in Scotland at the time, so it went down to London, which was a bit scary. I can remember packing it into the lorry. However, the Montrose Harbour Board paid for the sculpture, and he's a familiar face down Horse Street on the river side, the north side of the river, South Esk in Montrose. So the plaster ended up back in here, which seemed a good way of keeping it. And so it started off the programme, and eventually all the plasters were so cast. But Lamb's plan was to do a larger than life size of 3, and he was very keen on working men. The seafarer you've just seen, the fisherman. This was a trawl hand, a minesweeper, sorry, I was saying trawl hand. And when it was cast, it went down to the seafront in Montrose. And of course, if you were here during the 40s, then these people were really, really important in sweeping mines, because Montrose was quite an important port and was bombed and attacked during the Second World War. A great many of these ones, he would have several models, so sometimes he would pick someone different to do the head and take the body of someone else. So the third and the last one we managed to get cast was Bill the Smith, which was a chap called Bill Lawrence, in fact, and he was a smith. So again, Lamb's real interest in just working men. So what I like about these two guys is that when we got them cast, I was very keen to have them standing on the ground, no plinth, because so many sculptures are just set up on a pillar. And that's paid dividends because both Bill the Smith, who now sits in the High Street, and the minesweeper, who sits down at the seafront, I've seen lots of photographs, often in tourist brochures, of little kiddies holding their hands. It's brilliant. Sometimes they do get appendages, as you can imagine, but that does bring them into the centre. So I think Lamb has paid back the people of Montrose by having, I think, half a dozen sculptures now out and about in the town. Well, that's the main studio. We'll just have a wee look at the two other rooms we've got here. Rather unpoetically, we simply call this the workshop. And this is where Lamb did most of his etching. And this is the original table that he constructed for the etching. And you can still see where the bolts and the big press were. We know where the press is, but and I'm very keen to get it back here as a working press, but that's still long term. But what you see around here is that etchings made him a fair bit of money. He did a cycling tour in 22-23 of France mainly and partly Italy, and he took a great many of these drawings and produced etchings in Castle, and you can see there. And he did this principally as a method of funding his bronze work because it was so expensive. And he did exhibit a great many of these, and he did indeed sell a fair number of them. And we're very fortunate to have this grand collection of etchings, pencil and ink drawings, and these are all fairly carefully encapsulated and can be looked through. So we have a few thousand when you top them up. Lamb was a curator's nightmare in that he quite often didn't sign things. He gave things different names, and anyone who has some knowledge of etchings knows that you meant to number them, which he didn't. They're not always easy to identify. As I say, most of these were done in France, small number in Italy. There are some local ones, and he again, like the maquettes we were looking at, he loves the salmon fishermen in the little cobles captures. It's a huge piece of social history as well, because this is a life that has gone completely, and sometimes you've no idea where something is, but there are poplars. We do have a diary of his, and I've had colleagues who have not replicated the cycling tour, but certainly done it by car. But again, some nice local views of this time from Montrose Basin, looking towards the brig and the sea and the skies. You know, one little squiggle that goes on for miles and miles. Another local one with the familiar Montrose steeple. And you can see how he captures the fisherwomen, presumably collecting mussels from the basket there. All different sizes as well, which is great fun. And the boat builder that we looked at, the little maquette, here we are. I mean, that's so valuable as a piece of history in Montrose boat building. I think the last coble was made a few years ago, and there are very few. I had a friend who made a film of it, but here we have an actual boatyard in Montrose with the workers at it. As I say, not all of them are identifiable. Looks more like local fishing boats. And I think that's an Italian market scene. He didn't like crowds, but he was a keen observer. He would tuck himself into a corner and off he went. You can see the kind of sculptural dimension in some of these fishermen. If we look at some of the maquettes through there, you know, so similar with their caps. Again, this looks like Ferry Dane. a fishing village, sadly no longer. And again, I'm not entirely sure of that one. Might be Aberdeen. He did spend a bit of time up there at Robert Gordon's. Again, a Montrose basin scene. These are much sought after when they do come up, but as you can see from this one, no signature, no date, no title. But it's a wonderful collection, and you could spend years trying to research all this and end up pulling all your hair out. And we have a wee selection of some of the etchings. That's a very rare portrait, apart from the Foggie, and that was Nan Sim, the lady who gave him his winter studio, as it were, in the 20s. It's reckoned to be about 1932-33, and you can see that he's compared to the self-portrait some years before that, he doesn't look so well, because a great many of the injuries from the First World War, I think, did affect his health through the rest of his life, sadly. But there's a small selection of some of his working tools, including some leather working. There's a wee etching plate there of, I think it's an Italian scene, and we also have the actual acid bath has survived as well, where these plates would have been popped into acid. Right, we'll call it the drawing room. Lamb did all the wood panelling and stairs here. They do creak a wee bit, but I quite like that when I'm here. I know when someone comes upstairs. So Lamb made a beautiful job of the wood panelling in here, and it's all very carefully constructed so that you can actually hang pictures on the wall. Now, when Lamb got planning permission for this in 34-35, it was with the express condition that he did not sleep here, and yet there is a bed. He did latterly, because there was a little wash-hand basin, and obviously we've lost all the soft furnishings, and all the furniture was produced by him. It's very, very different. I'm sure some furniture makers would rave about some of these, but this was principally where he did a lot of watercolours. We've got what's left of the easel, and he will use the word entertained here as well. Now, when ordinary folk came in, you would get a cup of tea downstairs, and if there'd been a lot of plaster work on, there'd be a lovely coat of plaster on your tea. But up here, and I have this in very good authority, David Lamb, his nephew, and the person who was apprentice before he went off to fight in the Second World War, was a member of the advisory committee when I came in 1977. So David related quite a lot of the stories to me about Lamb, and I have it on good authority that the then Duchess of York actually came here, visited Lamb, and had a cup of tea here. Now, as I say, you got it in a mug downstairs. That was low tea on a bit of paper, but there was actually a tablecloth and spode china when the Duchess came here. But there's no record of that in any official document, as far as I know, other than someone who would never tell a fib anyway, David. Yeah, great stuff. And we have to keep the lux levels very low here, because there is a selection of some of his watercolours. Again, a curator's nightmare. Many unsigned, undated, and yet they're readily identifiable as Lamb, thank goodness, you know. And we've a wee selection of some photographs. He wasn't a person who had many photographs taken of him, but just a few of his younger life with his brothers. He was a cricketer, keen footballer, Queen's own Cameron Highlander when he was injured, and these last ones in his latter life, and there's the photograph actually taken up here working at a watercolour. We've got a couple of documents over here that you might like to see. The Guthrie Award, which was given in 1929, that was for the up-and-coming Young Artist of the Year. It still goes on as far as I'm aware. In fact, I had a good friend who also won it some years ago. Again, that didn't really hit the press so much, but this is when he was elected ARSA, and that caused almost as much of a stir as the royal connection, because everybody thought, what? Somebody from Montrose? One of his family friends thought he'd been elected to the church council, but it was more important than that. So he was very proud of that, although he exhibited in the RSA virtually every year from 25 right to his death. He was not keen to go to exhibition openings. He was teetotal, didn't have a great view of people who drank. His father had been an alcoholic, and he didn't like social gatherings. He wasn't really a very social sort of character, but nonetheless he was a great supporter of RSA, and there was a great posthumous exhibition in 1951, and indeed they've exhibited works since then as well. Well, sadly in 1951 Lamb died, early days of the month of January, and on his deathbed he made a wish that the studio and all its works be given to his town, the town. And his sister pretty well handled all that, and the Montrose Town Council agreed on that in 1952 or thereabouts, and we have a record of that. So it took Montrose Town Council at that time ran no cultural facility whatsoever, so this was a new venture for them. Anyway, they did quite a bit of work on it, and David Lamb, his nephew, was involved in that, and George Fairweather, the architect, was involved in that. And to cut a very long story short, it was bona fide, as it were, and reopened as the William Lamb Memorial Studio in 1955. And Montrose Town Council ran that with an advisory committee right through to local government reorganisation in 1975, whereupon Angus District Council took it over. And the first convener at that time was the late councillor George Norrie. So George came in there to have a look at it to see what needed doing, and it was in a terrible state, I'm afraid, because Montrose Town Council, God bless their cotton socks, did not do a good job. However, one of George's first wishes was that we renovate, which we did, and we reopened it in 1978. I had just moved from Dundee Museum to here, so it was one of my very first projects with Angus. And the Friends themselves were formed in 1977, so I was around at that time as well. And their main role was to support the work of the council, which they've continued to do. When local government reorganisation came about in 1996, the then Angus Council took over all these responsibilities, and that it did until just a few years ago, when there was a slight change in the thinking. But again, the Friends stepped in, and we made I was retired by then. We made had an agreement with Angus Council that as long as they looked after the building, we would open it to the public, and that's the way it's been up to now.